Good morning, everyone. We are back with the Monolith M1060 versus the M1070 review. We're doing the comparison of the sound signature between these two headphones, what they can provide, how they are different from each other if they are. We just uploaded the bass comparison, and I found that the 1070 has sonically a slightly different presentation of the bass compared to the 1060. The 1070 has a bit more separation between the sub bass and the mid bass. It sounds a little clearer than the 1060 in the sub bass and mid bass. The mids, when all that is combined, the mids sound a little bit better separated with the 1070 than the 1060 when the bass is involved in the song. And overall, that the 1070 tends to have a slightly wider soundstage, and these are all noticeable differences between the two. It's not a night and day difference. Now, I have my own personal standard of what is, marginal improvement or not improvement, whether there's a big difference, a night and day difference, a noticeable difference. And so there's a whole big spectrum that I personally have. So when I say night and day, I mean that a pair of headphones compared to another is so vastly different that it is a night and day difference. Like, they're sonically different. There's just no two ways about it. Then there's the middle ground, which is, noticeable, which is that when you listen to headphones back and forth, A and B, you start picking up nuanced differences between them. And you can say, okay, now that I have the character of the particular headphones, I can say that headphone number 2 sounds, X, Y, and Z. It sounds, it has more soundstage, it has more clarity, blah, 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 blah. It's not a great difference, but it is a noticeable difference. And then finally, on the other end, at the very bottom, is no difference whatsoever, where I can't even tell the difference, or it's so minute, it's so small that it's hard to distinguish whatever differences there might be. So today we're just, now in this video, we're going forward with the, hi Charlie. We're going forward with the mids test, and I have 3 songs queued. I have Why Am I Like This by Ursula Gartland, Want You Back by Haim, and Superposition by Young the Giant. I have both headphones plugged into an A-B switch, which is itself plugged into the Monolith THX 888 desktop, currently at negative 25.5 decibels. Let's get started with Why Am I Like This, and I have the 1060 on my head. Here we go. Negative 25.5 is actually a pretty appropriate volume. Just loud enough for me to hear the song without it hiding my voice. So I can still hear myself speaking, but I can hear the song clearly. I'm going to increase the volume to negative 20. I can hear the guitar very clearly, but there's no reverberation to the guitar. It's very, very quick. The voice is crystal clear. There's a bit of like this bump in her voice. It's sibilant, and it's just it's a little too much. Like at negative 20 decibels, it's very obvious. Any louder, and I think it would get pretty harsh for me. So let's try. I'm going to go up to negative 15. Yeah, now I'm negative 15. And I could hear a little bit of that graininess and that harshness to her voice, maybe around 5K, 6K, something like that. It's just, it can become harsh at higher volumes. Her voice is undistorted. I could hear the bass, I could hear the drum, and the guitar, the acoustic guitar. The guitar has this kind of weird echoing effect where it sounds like there's 2 of them, but there's only one. Now that everything at the mix is playing, you have the drum, the guitar, piano, her voice. Her voice is ahead of all the instruments. I would say easily a step ahead of everything on our imaginary sound stage. The bass is not overwhelming her voice at all. The bass is fairly fast. It's transient. No distortion in the bass that bleeds into the mids. So the vocals are not overwhelmed by the bass. Okay. So one thing I will say is that there is a bit of harshness to her voice. Now, if you've ever listened to Orla Gartland's song, Why Am I Like This, you can tell that there is grain in her voice just naturally. It's a very raw kind of presentation because I don't think it's really mixed with any auto tuning, right? It's just her singing. And there are some headphones that accentuate it. There are some headphones that roll off her voice and smooth it out considerably. Now the 1060, I don't think they smooth it out. I think there's just this peak somewhere, and I want to say probably around 5K, maybe 6K, somewhere around there, where her voice gets really peaky in some instances, and it's like it gets grainy, and that just peak starts getting a little bit harsh for me. Now it may be good for other people, but for me it's just a little bit harsh. So let's switch to the 1070. Okay, I've got the 1070 on my head. We are at negative 15 decibels. That's where I'm going to leave it. And let's restart now. I'm listening to the guitar, and the guitar seems to have a bit more volume to it, and it has a slightly longer reverb to it than it did on the 1060. It could be because it just sounds more full on the 1070 than on the 1060. Her voice is clear. In fact, it sounds as clear as it did on the 1060. I don't hear that 6K peak, 5 or 6K peak. I don't hear the sibilance. I mean, her voice is close to being sibilant, just to her natural tonality, but it's not accentuated like it was on the 1060, and I haven't changed the volume. It's still at negative 15. I can increase the volume. Let's go to negative 13. And even at negative 13, this is louder than the 1060 was playing. There's no grain. That grain is not present like it was on the 1060. In fact, I don't hear a grain at this point. There's still energy in her voice. You can still hear that sibilance almost to the threshold, but it's well controlled. It's just underneath. So it doesn't smooth out her voice at all. The 1060 didn't either. But it also doesn't accentuate any grain, and it doesn't have a peak like the 1060 did. No harshness, no ear piercingness. The bass, the drum is clearly separate from her voice, and I would say that the mids are, with the 1070, are probably at least a step and a half to 2 steps ahead. So there's a difference in the way that the mids are presented here than the 1060, where it's a little bit more forward on the 1070. Overall, I think that you can definitely tell a difference, A and B, where the 1070 doesn't have the accentuated graininess, that peak in her voice that the 1060 seems to present. The bass is well controlled, just like on the 1060. I don't really hear any difference there, to be honest. What I did hear as a difference is the guitar, where the guitar sounded a bit more full, more bodied on the 1070 than on the 1060. Now, what does that mean? The way I would describe it is to say that the reverberation of the guitar plucking has a little bit less volume on the 1060, even though I compared the two headphones basically the same volume. And on top of that, I think that the reverberation of that guitar frequency is a little bit more lingering on the 1070 than on the 1060. The 1060 just kind of, you pluck it and it moves on real quick. And that's not, with the lower emphasis on the guitar frequency coupled with the faster reverberation of the guitar, I think you lose basically the character of that acoustic guitar. But with the 1070, you get the volume of the guitar. You also get the reverberation of the acoustic guitar. That to my ears, my personal opinion, I think is probably a little bit more natural sounding than on the 1060. All right, so let's go back to 1060. And oh gosh, this headband is the worst thing in the world because it just keeps flopping all over the place. All right, I got a 1060 on my head. Let's go back down to negative 20. and we're at negative 20 decibels. Let's go to the next song, which is Want You Back by Haim. Here we go. And negative 20 is loud enough that I can barely hear my voice at this point. I would not listen to this any louder. Now, there's one portion of this song that I always bring up. It's about 8 seconds in, where she says the word we, and the letter W is dragged out. It sounds grainy. It sounds gravelly. That's just the natural tonality that she has. Some headphones hide it. Other headphones accentuate it. And there are very few headphones that just bring it out in the mix without it being harsh. Now, I just listened to it. I want to listen to it again, and I'll tell you what I hear. So we're back at 5 seconds. Yeah. I hear it, but it sounds a little bit muted. So this is what I expect to hear is accurate. Something like this. Something like that. And if that's not how she sings, but just imagine it. This is how the 1060 does it. So there's a slight difference in the way that the headphone presents it. It's a little bit, tiny bit muffled. So there is that. So let's just keep going. I can hear the piano, the guitar very clearly. Now you've got the two backup vocalists, left and right. Excellent separation of those three vocalists. Absolutely crystal clear. They're both different tonalities the backup vocalists have. Left and right ear cup. The one thing I would say is that for some strange reason, the primary vocalist sounds like a step behind the primary vocal or the backup vocalist when they first come in. And now when we're getting all the mix in, you got the drum, the piano, the guitar, and all three singers. It's really not that easy to separate the two tonalities of the backup vocalist. They meld together quite a lot. And I'm trying to listen really hard, and I can't separate them. I can hear the primary vocalist clearly. There's no doubt about that. It's just that I can't hear the separation of the two backup vocalists when everything in the mix is playing. No harshness that I can hear. That peak that I was talking about with Orla Gartland's song is not present because the song simply doesn't have it. Yeah, so when there's nothing playing, when you only have the guitar and the drum just gently playing, you could hear the two different tonalities of the backup vocalist, left and right, crystal clear. But when you start adding everything else in the song, you bring in the primary vocalist, you bring up the volume on the drums, you bring in some electronic synth that's kind of mastered in here, and you increase the piano. You start playing the instruments a little bit louder and harder, and the vocalists come back in. The two backup vocalists sound melded, so their tonalities are hard to distinguish from each other. That's not some other headphones can easily distinguish all of that. They can separate the vocalists even when all the music is playing, and the 1060 tends to meld it together. So let's switch to the 1070 and try it again. All right, let's restart, and here we go. We're still at negative 20. I'm going to increase to negative 15. And that's almost equal volume. Now let's stop and go back to the word we, like we talked about initially. Yeah, it's a little bit clearer on the 1070 than on the 1060, just a tiny bit. It's almost like there's mist in front of you, early morning mist as you're walking down on a trail or something. And with the 1070, it's just less misty. So you can hear that visceral gratiness in the word we a bit clearer on the 1070 than on the 1060. It's not a night and day difference. It's more of a nuance, very tiny nuance difference, but it is noticeable when you do one of these A and B tests. Let's keep going. The voice is clear, no harshness. There's no sibilance. I hear the backup vocalist crystal clear. In fact, I think there's probably a little bit more soundstage on the 1070 on the 1060. It just sounds a bit wider. Their echo in their voices lingers just a tiny bit longer. I could hear each individual vocalist, and the primary vocalist actually sounds about half a step ahead of the backup vocalist, whereas on the 1060 it sounded, the primary vocalist sounded like half a step behind for some strange reason. Now everything the mix is playing, and I can hear the difference in the two backup vocalist tonality. So at this portion of the song, about 55 seconds in, you have the drum, you have the guitar, you have the piano, you have some electronic whatever they've mixed in. You have all three vocalists, and everything is playing at at decent volume. They're playing. They're not strumming. They're actually playing their instruments, right? And the vocalists are singing at optimum volume for them. With the 1060, what happened is that the backup vocalists tended to meld together, and it was really, really hard for me to differentiate the tonality. In fact, I couldn't. With the 1070, I can still hear them. Now, it's not a night and day difference. It's just obvious to me. When I'm listening here, I'm sitting here, I'm listening, I'm going, yeah, I hear it. It's not to the extent like for the focal clear, which that would be a night and day difference, where it's just absolutely clear that the backup vocalists have different tonalities all the way through the song. No muffling, no hiding that detail at all. With the 1070, it's not to that level. It's simply, it's more clear, more separated, better soundstage. It's a tiny bit more soundstage than on the 1060. So let's keep listening. Yeah, I could hear a different tonality on the left ear cup than on the right ear cup with the backup vocalist. The bass is very well controlled. I think it has a tiny bit more impact on the 1070 than on the 1060, but it has a very fast transients. It does not interfere with the mids, and it is not distorting. The 1060 wasn't distorting either, by the way, the bass. Yeah. Otherwise, there's no harshness, there's no grain, there's no peakiness, there's no ear pierciness. Everything is just really well separated. There's a bit of brushing shoulders with the mid bass and the upper register of the mid bass, almost going to the treble region. There's not hardline separation, but that melding actually is still more clear than what the 1060 does. Where the 1060 is almost like, so some of the vocalists get mixed together, they get melded, can't hear the separation. The bass is not as impactful as the 1070. I think the 1070 for the drum on this is probably just a tiny bit more impactful, a little bit more volume. But that particular drum thing is a very, very minor issue. I think the bigger one for me is the separation of the backup vocalist is obviously more on the 1070. And a slightly wider soundstage. It just, you have a slightly more open feeling. Now, when I'm talking about soundstage, I have to emphasize that I'm not saying that it sounds like you're standing outside in a big field listening to this at a concert using amazing loudspeakers. That's not the soundstage I'm referring to. I think that the 1060 probably have average soundstage, and I think the 1070 have above average soundstage. So average soundstage would be like you're listening to good bookshelf speakers in a living room that can seat, family of 5. I'm just picking a number. The 1070 seems to, same sort of living room, maybe a little bit bigger, right? You can stand in the kitchen with the living room facing you, and you can still hear it. That's the difference, right? A closed-off living room versus one that has one wall knocked down, and you've got a walk-through kitchen, essentially. That's how much bigger it is. It's not a huge difference. It's just noticeable. Okay, so let's go to our last song. Let me switch to the 1060 first. Oops. Oh, God. All right, so our last song is going to be Superposition by Young the Giant. I have negative 15 decibels. I'm going to bring it down to negative 20 to start. Here we go. And here we go on Superposition. It starts up with drums, And the drums sound a little bit muffled, almost like there's something covering the drum head. I could hear a string instrument. I've always thought it was a ukulele or something, and it's not a ukulele. It's something else. It's not a guitar. There is a bass guitar in the mix all at the bottom. You could hear it, but it's not quite separated from the drum. It's melding. Here's the male vocalist. He is clear, no distortion, no harshness, no sibilance. He sounds about probably a step to 2 steps ahead of the mix of all the instruments in our imaginary soundstage. The bass doesn't seem to distort his voice at all. Now you have the backup vocalist coming in, but I can't hear different tonalities there. They're mixed together all as one. So, but I hear his voice clearly. The backup vocalists sound just more as an echo than as separate individuals in a mix. I don't hear any grain in the song, no harshness. Now, with that bass guitar, one thing I've noticed is that I heard it at the very beginning, but throughout the mix here, I couldn't hear it. I mean, it was just coming in and out. It was really hard to tell. So the separation there with the drum and the bass guitar is not particularly good in the sense that you can't hear that separate instrument. You can hear the drum. You can't really hear the bass unless everything else is quiet or there's a pause in the other instruments. And you can hear the lingering effect of that guitar having just been played. And so if you're looking for that finite detail, if you're looking for layers of detail, if you're looking to try to find all those other instruments in a mix, I don't think the 1060 really does the song much justice for that specific reason, trying to find each and every single instrument as the song is playing. I think it's a little bit too muddy for that between the drum and the bass guitar. All right, so let's switch to the 1070. And I'm going to increase the volume to -15. Just trying to get it just about the same volume here. Let's restart, and here we go. I would say that the bass sounds a bit more full on the 1070 than on the 1060. Just a little bit more volume. It's a slight bump on the frequency. Let me go down to -20 decibels and let me test there, because I want to make sure it's not just the volume here. Yeah, -20 decibels on the 1070 is lower volume than -20 decibels on the 1060. I can say that. So let me bring it up to -17. Let's see if that's equal volume here. Not quite. Maybe -16 is as close as I can get it. So even though these two headphones have very similar impedance, the same impedance, I think it's 60, it's not. It's just not getting the same volume. The 1060 has more volume at the same decibel volume setting on the amplifier than the 1070. The 1070 needs a bit more, and the gain here adjustment is probably another 4 decibels or so, 3 to 4 decibels to get equal volume between the two. At least that's my experience. So we're at -16. I'll just keep it at -16. Keep playing. Even with the volume match, it sounds like that the bass has slightly more emphasis. It's a tiny bit. It's a little bit more impact. The reverberation sounds about the same. The transient sounds about the same to me, however. His voice is crystal clear. No harshness. He sounds probably about easily a step or two ahead of the instruments in our soundstage, just like the 1060. I could hear that bass guitar clearly. I mean, I could hear. So I hear the drum playing. I hear the banjo instrument, whatever that is. I hear the bass guitar. I hear his voice. It's just so clear. The separation between the bass guitar and the drum is so much more obvious on the 1070 than on the 1060, and the 1060 just kind of muddied it a little bit, and so it was hard to get that tonality. But the 1070, I have to say, that separation is, like I said, it's obvious. So that for that particular comparison, just that very, very narrow comparison. So here's the question: how does the bass guitar sound compared to the 1060? Right? When the drum and the bass guitar are playing, what is the difference between these two headphones? For that very narrow question, I would say that's a night and day difference. For that very, very narrow question, the bass guitar sounds much more clear, better separated, more obvious clarity, more obvious separation on the 1070 than on the 1060. Okay, let's keep playing. And you're going to get the backup vocalist right about now. And they don't sound like an echo like it did on the 1060. Instead, what it sounds like is multiple vocalists coming in and just amplifying each other's voice instead of as an echo effect. So on the 1060, it sounded, there was just some weird resonance or something going on with the mids where it sounded like there was an echo right after he says a word that just keeps reverberating. Whereas with the 1070, it's actually in tune. And instead of an echo, it sounds more like an amplification. So if you ever go to an a cappella group, for example, or if you ever listen to a cappella, and you got all these people standing there, they're all singing the same lyrics, right? Most of the time. Some of the time. Singing the same lyrics, and when one person's singing and another person comes in and starts singing and another person comes in and starts singing the same lyrics and they're in tune, what happens is that you get an amplification of the tonality of their voices. And so they build on each other. Now, obviously, the tonality changes. So two people coming into a mix sound different from just one person singing, right? Because their voices are mixed. They don't have the same voice. But it doesn't sound like an echo. The 1060 sounds more like an echo than it does amplification of multiple vocalists. The 1070 sounds like amplification of multiple vocalists instead of an echo. Let's keep playing. No harshness, no peakiness, no distortion. In fact, I can hear a sharp intake of breath on the left ear cup that I did not hear on the 1060. There's just a bit more separation there. You know, when you have better separation of the bass from the mids, and you have a little bit wider soundstage, what happens is that you can start picking up all these nuances. When he's saying, I want you, you want me, you know, he's taking in that sharp intake of breath. It's very fast. And there's no spike there. It's not like it's ear piercing. It's not that. I'm just telling you, I hear the intake of breath. And it's just, that's something that wasn't really quite obvious on the 1060. It was a bit more muffled on the 1060. On the 1070, it comes out in an obvious way. So let's go back and let's listen to that. Start at 112. I still got the 1070 on my head. Yeah, 2, 1, me. It's more like a panting that you can hear. Let me switch to the 1060. Bring this back down to about -20 so we can get equal volume here. Headband. And let's try this again. Yeah, it just sounds more muffled on the 1060 than on the 1070. It's just, it's an obvious difference. And part of the reason I say it is because the 1070 has a bit more separation there, a bit more soundstage, whereas the 1060 is kind of, it's melding a little too much. Now, the intake of breath is audible on the 1060. It's just not as clear as it is on the 1070. Let me try it again. Yeah, you could easily miss it. Switching back to the 1070, back to -16 decibels. Here we go again. Yeah, I think it's noticeably different. It's just a little bit more clear on the 1070 than on the 1060. Now, is it the same type of difference that we heard as with the obvious difference that we have, the night and day difference about the bass guitar versus the drum? No, it's not that type. So the very narrow question, as I said, that's why I said it was a very, very narrow question. That was a night and day difference. As far as the sharp intake of breath, it's not night and day. It's just an obvious difference. You can hear it a little bit more clear on the 1070. Okay, so let's talk about conclusions. We're starting to get a picture of the 1070 when compared to the 1060. And this is why it is critical for people to do A and B tests and do them as thoroughly as they possibly can. It's important for people to understand what each headphone is capable of doing before they make a conclusion about how the headphone will respond compared to another one. In other words, if I have a pair of headphones and I say X headphone sounds X, Y, and Z, 1, 2, and 3, better than Y headphone that I haven't actually tested against. That's a difficult claim to support and a difficult claim for people to really accept because you haven't really done the A and B test. Because, yeah, you might be right that there might be differences. You might find a 1, 2, and 3 in brand X versus brand Y. But then you won't be able to tell how much of that difference is there. Does that kind of make sense? So I think there's more to comparing products than just saying one is different from the other. I think it's just as relevant to say the amount of difference, right? The bass is clear on the 1070. You just say that flat out. It's clear on the 1070. Okay, that gives an impression that this is really clear bass. It's unmuffled. It's fast, and whatever else you want to attribute to it. But if you're not precise about it, then it gives the impression to the other person that the 1070 is night and day different because it's better. What does better mean? What does that mean? You have an idea, but the other person doesn't. That's why doing an A and B test is crucial, and telling people in detail what you hear is critical. I say all of this to emphasize once again that the 1070 is not a night and day different headphone from the 1060. It is a different tonality in some respects. It's got a different way of presenting the music, for sure. But it's not so extravagantly different that you might go, wow, this is not something I've ever heard before. Like I liked the 1060 sound before. I don't know if I'd like the 1070. That's not the case. If you didn't like the 1060 sound before, you may not like the 1070. Let me put it that way as well. So you've got the 1060. Let's say you've heard it. You have an understanding of what it sounds like. The 1070 basically takes that very similar tonality and then adds a little bit more to it, a little bit more separation of the frequency range, a little bit more soundstage, a little bit more clarity. And when we start talking about these little bit more things, I'm trying to tell you whether or not it is so obvious that you might go, oh my goodness, I had no idea that Monolith could make a headphone that was so much more superior to the 1060. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, it's the total opposite, which is that this is a nuanced change from the 1060. Now, you might be the type of person that listens to songs that will never, ever take advantage of the slight separation, the slightly better soundstage of the 1070 versus the 1060. And so you will never appreciate the difference. Or you're just not the type of person who cares. In which case, then it really doesn't matter. But if you're the type of person that goes, look, I really want a good planar magnetic headphone, good build quality that has this type of tonality, whatever tonality you are looking for, then choosing between the 1060 and 1070 is probably a meaningful decision. If you already have the 1060 and you're thinking, should I upgrade to the 1070? Well, I would probably upgrade for different reasons. I'm giving you, I haven't done the treble test yet, so I don't know how that will respond yet, including the detail retrieval. But just talking about the bass and the mids at this point, I don't think that it makes a whole lot of sense if you already have the 1060 to go out and buy the 1070 because the tonality is not vastly different between the two. There are nuanced differences for sure. There are differences of separation and clarity and soundstage and all the stuff we've already talked about. And if that, for you, the amount of differences I can describe to you, if that to you means, yes, I need to go out and buy the 1070, then that's fine. That's totally cool. But I would not put that as the primary reason to go out and, quote, upgrade from the 1060 to the 1070. I think that you have to take into all the other factors involved here. The more important factor for me, other than the slight differences in tonality, is that I think the 1070 is just better built. The headband is not wonky like the 1060. The ear cups don't float around in 360 degrees like the 1060. I think the comfort level is slightly better on the 1070 than on the 1060. So taking that into consideration, maybe that combined with slight variances in sound character might be justification for you to say to yourself, yeah, I think I want to try the 1070 instead of the 1060 anymore. Or I want to sell my 1060 and get the 1070. Or I want the 1070 in addition to the 1060. I wouldn't say that the 1070 is adding anything on top of the 1060 that you could say this is an addition to the 1060. For example, I have my workflow and I listen to the 1060, then I'm going to put on my 1070 to get the accuracy. I wouldn't say that. I think that they're too similar in nature for you to say I use the 1060 to, just for example, I use the 1060 to mix the music, and then I use the 1070 then to monitor it after it's been mixed. I don't think you're going to get what you're thinking of then. I don't think you're going to get the type of response from the 1070 that you're thinking. They're not that type of headphone. They have very similar tonalities in the bass and the mids. There are nuanced differences between these two, and noticeable nuanced differences. And I think, in my opinion, meaningful nuanced differences. But the nuance is just that. They're slight. And if you've already purchased the 1060, you're happy with it, then maybe the 1070 is not really the next step for you, maybe. If you sell the 1060 and then you go, now I have $150, $200 in my pocket, and now I want to put that into the 1070. Okay, now that's totally cool. But going out and buying the 1070 when you already have the 1060, expecting that the 1070 is going to be vastly different, not so much. At least not for the bass and not for the mids. Nuanced differences, meaningful differences, obvious differences. In one very, very specific respect, night and day difference. But other than that, very similar in sound character, which is fine, because Monolith has its own house sound, which is totally fine. I hope that this has been of some help. If you have been wondering between these two headphones, which one you should get, which one is possibly the one for you, hopefully these tests are helpful and meaningful to you. If you like my content, if you like anything I do on my channel, then I would hope that you would consider donating a couple bucks to me on Patreon. For the price of one cup of coffee from Starbucks a month, you could help me keeping this channel going, helping me save money so that I can buy new and old products that I can test thoroughly for you. If you like this content and you haven't subscribed, hey, think about subscribing. We are well over 960 subscribers at this point, which is fantastic. We've already exceeded the 950 mark that I had before the end of the year. So, hey, if it's at all possible to get about 40 more subscribers so we can get to 1,000 before the end of the year, that'd be fantastic, because then I can actually post things on YouTube, little postcard things instead of videos all the time. Because YouTube requires you to have at least 1,000 subscribers before you can start doing things. It's just really irritating. So if we can, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, well, hey, maybe next year. I hope all of you have a wonderful end of your weekend, and you have a very, very pleasant week coming up. Take care.